Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Matt and Miner in the Morning. Today it's just Matt recording. I'm going to take you through a series of 3 videos covering the growing season that was 2021. Now that we've moved on to 2022 on this very cold January day, I thought I'd bring us back today to springtime to talk about some of our challenges with planting and emergence in April and May is the main time frame that I will be discussing today. So we think about 2021, I describe it as a rewarding, yet also very challenging year. I think those challenges are just something we've all come to expect in this industry. But today we're really going to be focusing on what we saw in April and May, which were mainly cool and dry conditions, very little soil moisture, and then after planting, a lot of issues with uneven emergence, variable seedling depth, et cetera, and also some frost that kind of moved in that early May timeframe, right around that last frost date. You can kind of see here, I've got the rest of the summer mapped out. We'll cover June and July in the next video, which gets us through most of the vegetative and the early part of the reproductive stage. And then we'll jump to more late reproductive maturity and harvest in our last video. All right. Talking about early on, we had very cold soils early. And what you're going to see in this presentation is I like to go back and see what were agronomists like myself, colleagues at Iowa State, other industry personnel talking about on social media at the time. It kind of gives you a look back into what we were all discussing. So Twitter's very good for that. You'll see a lot of those posts pulled out of here. And while we had some corn and soybeans planted in Iowa before April 20th, most of it was well after that. Our soils were pretty cold early on. As you can see, a tweet here from myself on April 14th. I stuck a thermometer in a bean field that morning, and it was 38 degrees. That's pretty cold. There were some beans. I actually had a soybean plot planted on April 11th. So in soils that were definitely much colder than that 38 degrees. I also put a poll here on April 21st, and 73% of the respondents, which could be from who knows where, said that they had not planted a seed yet. So that said, it warmed up very quickly once we got to about April 22nd. This is kind of the image you see here is a 4-inch soil depth picture from Iowa State's soil temperature map. On the 22nd, you see most of those soil temps were still in that 45 to 50 degree range, but we were warming. The reason soil temperature is important is because we actually do need GDUs, not just when corn and soybeans are above ground and growing, but also we need to accumulate them to get them out of the soil. That's what this picture talks about here. If we've got soil temps that are in the 50s, it can take around 2 weeks for our crops to emerge. That's what we want, or we would like that time frame to be even shorter, more like a week, which is why we usually recommend waiting for a 50 degree and warming trend before we start planting. If we're in the 40s, now we're looking at 3 weeks, possibly even a month to get that seed out of the ground. And once we hit April 22nd, as I mentioned, we slammed a lot of corn and soybeans into the ground, a lot. You can see here from Farm Policy on Twitter, check out that chart, the way that jumped. By May 2nd, we had about 70% of our corn crop planted. That's 9 days ahead of the 5-year average. And you can see that in that jump in the red line there. So we really shot up in that window. I would say most people had almost all of their corn planted in that window. And also a lot of people were done with beans, especially if you had started 2 planters at the same time, like a lot of farmers are doing across the state. So as we look at a few other graphs here, I pulled soil temp on April 29th. So 7 days after the 22nd, when we were well below 50, now our soil temperatures are all well above 50. Except for maybe in the very northern part of Iowa, they were still just over 50. The other thing I wanted to show you as well was just thinking about how dry we were in April. We were all well below normal precip by a couple inches. Normally, April is a fairly wet month for us, which makes planting challenging. A dry April is not necessarily a bad thing, but when you consider how dry we were the year before, rolling into the spring with very little subsoil moisture, now we had soil that was almost excessively dry and started to get really hard. And that caused some significant issues when it came to planting. And that's what we saw in May. We got into the ground, and then the emergence issues started. So these are all different images that I pulled from social media that I all think kind of exemplify what we saw. one of those issues that I talked about dry soil is soybeans planted on the 20th that Neil Borgmeyer captured here. And 9 days later, those seeds look like they did in the bag. So we were essentially storing them in the soil instead of in the bag in the warehouse or in the shop. And that just had to do with a couple different factors, right? Planting depth, tillage, soil type, and also where you were at on the landscape. Those all kind of had an influence on both seeding depth and also how quick and uniform emergence was. But in a lot of cases, this seed just sat in dry soil. Jeremy Miner noticed that as well. A lot of his findings, and we talked about this a lot during this time of year, was uneven emergence due to things like residue. We weren't able to move residue or had wind blow it right back over the rows. The soil stayed cooler under that residue. It wasn't able to get as much sunlight and to warm up as easily. We saw that especially in no-till fields where the amount of residue was really high. That caused that emergence to be very uneven and variable. And I thought another cool picture here from New Ag Supplies, differences in closing wheel settings. You see some rows over here with excellent even uniform emergence, and then a row with a closing wheel issue where that's what I would describe as a very poor stand. So little things made a big difference this spring when it came to uniformity of emergence, and I would say overall it was really pretty challenging, even though conditions were dry and fairly fit compared to most wet springs. We also had an early May frost. A couple of funny pictures here, especially this one of the Bernie being cold meme from Jason and Nicole. But we did get some frost. It was kind of in that mid-May timeframe, right around what the average last frost date is. And that really did impact soybeans. As again, with beans, when we plant early, we do incur some of that frost risk as the growing point can be above the ground. And if it's cold for long enough, 2 to 4 hours at below 30 degrees, we can kill some of those soybean plants. And we did see that in the northern part of the state. It was not widespread. A lot of times we did see regrowth, but it took 3 days or so to decide if replant was needed after we got that frost event. So waiting was important. I actually did see some corn damage as well. With little moisture in the soil, that frost was able to move down into the soil and get some shallower planted, recently emerged seedlings. That's pretty rare, but it definitely can happen. All right, getting into planting challenges, which is kind of the meat of what I wanted to talk about today. These were all caused by soil being very dry and very hard. I would wager probably drier than what a lot of our planting equipment has been tested in over the long run. If you think about our weather the last 10 years, going back to prior to 2016, a lot of wet springs, none quite as dry as what we've had the past couple of years. So one thing that I noticed this year was a very hard layer at 3 inches in the soil, a layer that we could not plant down through. Especially if you think about your traditional V opener, the deeper you're planting, the wider that furrow is, and the less stable it becomes. In general, a couple different planter types don't have a shoe that helps hold that furrow open past the disc openers. Sometimes that shoe in wet years can cause some issues with smearing and compaction, but in a dry year, that shoe or even a seed firmer can kind of help with that furrow stability. So what was happening, in my opinion, was as we were planting, the furrows were collapsing, or I had a few cooperators call me and say they looked like they were more exploding than collapsing. As we went by, again, planting deep with not much moisture, the furrows kind of crumbled and caved in on itself, and that caused uneven seed depth. I saw fields where seeds were planted anywhere from at the bottom of the furrow to right in the middle to, in some cases, even on top of the ground. And it changed depending on weight on the planter. For example, where the planter was full, it seemed to plant deepest. We also lost some ground contact. If you think about down pressure, if we've got that hard layer that we're hitting and we're adding more weight, we start to bounce. And the more weight that we add, the higher that planter continues to get lifted out of the ground. In some cases, large planters with a lot of weight were lifted completely out of the ground just due to how hard that soil was, especially in some no-till or cover crop situations where that field was almost as hard as a parking lot. I was in some of those fields as they were planted, and any sort of depth was a challenge. We learned this after the fact, but the best course of action was probably to just back off if you were running into that hard layer and plant at a more normal depth and wait for some moisture, which we did get near the middle of May. As you think about what we want to see in an ideal year, it's a furrow like you see in these pictures, right? We want to see a trench that's defined, but not compact. We want it to be able to hold together till the seed is at the bottom, but we don't want it to be, so forced down that we'll have issues with root development later on. You should be able to stop the planter, see an open trench without seed falling in, and also have it be still soft enough that you can easily pierce it with a knife. You should be able to take your pocket knife and withdraw it, or your depth checker, and withdraw it in and out of that furrow without having to put too much effort on it. Think about downforce. I think a lot of issues were caused by either not having downforce set correctly, not having enough pressure, and in some cases, I think even too much pressure despite it being dry. So, in terms of like a downforce 101, my crash course, which by the way, I'm no means an expert on this. This is just what I've picked up in my years of planting myself and helping customers. Downforce is really the force applied to the unit to reach that seeding depth. So you could call it the amount of force that we need to get the planter into the ground. There are ways we can change it, right? So we've got downforce with hydraulics, with pneumatics, with springs. So we can set springs and adjust them. We can inflate or deflate those bags. We can increase or decrease the amount of hydraulic down pressure. You can also remove ballast from your row unit or your bar if you've got that set up. And think about kind of how this also gets implemented. You've got your gauge wheels. They contact the soil and they've got adjustments there that can help influence your planting depth. And that's really what the gauge wheels do. They control that seeding depth. As we think about, the forces directly, this is kind of an overview of some of the forces you could possibly have on a row unit. This is not maybe going to be the same in every case, but just kind of as a general example. Think about your weight down. Your primary weight is going to come from your row unit. So anywhere from 150 to 200 pounds down onto the soil. As you start to add seed or fertilizer, insecticide, whatever it might be to your planter, to your row units, now you're adding, possibly another 150 pounds. So you could have 300 to 350 pounds just between your row unit and your box and your seed. And in some cases, that could be enough to get that planter into the ground. You've also got the ability to add additional down pressure, right, through those springs, airbags, hydraulics, whatever it might be. Usually in that 400 to 500 pound range is as much as you can add. And again, these weights are going to vary on the row units. Some are not nearly as heavy as 200 pounds. You could also add weight in the form of your row cleaners. It depends on what type. If they're fixed, floating, maybe they're clean sweeps that are hydraulically adjustable. It just kind of depends on your setup. In terms of up forces, we've got anything from possibly some weight from your row cleaners, your closing wheels, but the main source of that is going to be the resistance from the ground, which we call penetration resistance, right? That's how much weight is it taking to get your openers into the ground and your seed to depth. That's what the kind of the main up force on that planter. And that leads me to downforce margin, which I think is often misunderstood, and I do get a fair amount of questions about it. And how I want you to think about it is that's the weight on the gauge wheels at any time while you're planting. I guess a simpler version is the weight supported by the gauge wheels. So that's the additional weight that you need beyond what's currently being applied to get the soil into the ground. And the way I think about it is if you're between your row units and your seed, no additional down pressure, you've got 250 pounds going down, and the soil is pushing back up at 50 pounds, your margin is going to be 50 pounds, right? You can see that over here in this equation. That's your additional downforce applied to the row unit, subtracted from what the ground is pushing up. It's kind of a simple way to think about it. So in this case, your margin would be 50 pounds if you look at this example on the right. Now, where that changes is say the soil resistance is now 300 pounds. So in this case, your margin would actually be a minus 50, or otherwise saying you don't have enough weight to get that row unit into the ground. You would need to add additional downforce. So think about what affects your margin. Things like deeper planting depth, which we had this past year, high planting speeds. I think a lot of high-speed planters have become common, so we're planting a lot faster than we used to at 8 to 10 mile an hour. Dry soils, which again we have this spring. Some compaction, which we could have had. I think it was probably not a terrible year for compaction. And then heavier soil types, especially with high amounts of clay, all require you to carry a higher downforce margin. Those are all things that can make it more difficult, essentially, to get the furrow open and your seed to depth. That said, too much margin is essentially saying you've got too much extra weight available to get your furrow open, and that can actually cause compaction and other issues. So while setting a good margin is nice, we can actually overdo it, and I'll kind of get into some recommendations on that In terms of if you're watching margin, most modern planters will have some sort of on the display, either a downforce, a ground contact, a good ride. Those are all kind of related to downforce margin, but your margin is that actual weight. It's usually listed in pounds that you have on that screen. So some of my tips for planting this next year, I'm assuming we're going to be dry, hopefully not as dry as we were this past year. We got some nice fall rainfall that recharged our subsoil a little bit. If we catch some snow, we should be a little bit wetter. And again, April is usually a pretty wet month for us. But if we are that dry again and the ground is very hard, here are some of my recommendations. And my first goes the same every year, and that is to get out and check your settings early and often, and check them every time you change field. If you've got especially fields spread out over a wide area, you're going to have differences in management, differences in soil types, possibly differences in moisture. So all of those things can affect planter settings. If we are dry again and the ground's very hard, it's important to try to plant to moisture. That's what we always recommend. But if we're going much over 3 inches, that could be a bit excessive, especially if we're getting, I got questions about, 3.5 or deeper. Now we're starting to run into issues of getting that seed to actually merge before running out of energy. Again, also you're making that furrow that much wider. There's more air that you can bring into to building your furrow when you do that. Also, ground contact is an issue. If your planter is being lifted out of the ground, if you're set at 450 pounds to down pressure to try to get to 3 inches, I think the best course of action is to shallow up to a more normal depth and just wait for moisture. I know no one likes to do that, but I think that's going to give you a much better stand. That's going to be a lot more uniform. You can also use your row cleaners to move dry soil in tilled fields. It's not a normal recommendation. If you think about your row cleaners, you want those spikes to catch residue and to move it. Your row cleaners should normally be working 100% of the time. They say anywhere from 30 to 50% of the time is how often your row cleaners should be engaged. But if you've done a lot of tillage and you've got 2 to 3 inches of really dry soil, I had farmers that had good luck with moving that soil with your row cleaners, almost creating a pseudo ridge till to get the moisture a little bit easier. And if you cannot easily pierce your sidewall, again, mentioned that earlier, if you can't take a knife and get in and out of that sidewall very easily, it means you've probably applied too much down pressure. There's also a way to check that in the field. I'll get to that in a second. But giving a recommendation for margin really depends on a lot of things. Depends on how much weight's on your planter, what type of planter you have, what the planting conditions are. But in general, if our margin is 40 to 80 pounds of extra down pressure, that usually will get us covered even as soil conditions change. If it changes from 200 pounds of penetration resistance to 250, that margin would still have us covered without keeping, excess weight on your planter. But again, that's going to change. That's going to vary depending on your tillage strategy and how your planter is set up. The one thing I do recommend though is maintaining a ground contact of around 95%, 95 to 97%. If our ground contact is lower than that, it means we're having issues getting into the ground and we're going to have some varying planting depth. If we're at 100% all the time, these monitors don't accurately tell you if you're at 130% ground contact. They're not built that way. So you could be at 180% and not know it, which means you've got way too much weight. Not only are you causing some sidewall compaction issues, but you could be causing more wear and tear on your planting equipment than you need. So if you're consistently at 100 and it doesn't change, that probably means you're applying a little bit too much down pressure. And there's a way you can check that. That's by, when your planter's in the down position, get out and turn your gauge wheels by hand. And if it's very, very easy to turn, that means you probably don't have enough pressure on those gauge wheels. And if you can't turn it at all, or it takes a lot of work to move it a few inches, that means you've probably been putting down too much pressure on those gauge wheels. Okay, last thing I did want to cover while we're talking about it being kind of cool and dry. As I mentioned, while we did have some delayed emergence just due to moisture, residue, things like that, we also had a lot of herbicide injury that affected emergence and early season growth as well. You can see some of these pictures here, drawstring symptoms on soybean leaves from group 15 herbicides. This is a picture that I actually took of some carryover from a corn premix containing some clopyralid, atrazine, and mesotrione. And Paul Parcher noted this, channel agronomist in Northeast Iowa, corn seedlings bathing in some of those chloroacetamide products. So we're talking about your group 15, your long chain fatty acid inhibitors. that caused a lot of buggy whipping and those leaves struggling to unfurl. When it comes to the group 15 injuries, a lot of those were more cosmetic, but we did see some problems that really affected early growth and vigor from some products like metribuzin. Metribuzin does not always play nicely with both seed treatments and soybean varieties. Soybean varieties will carry different ratings for tolerances to herbicides like metribuzin. Again, it's a product that's metabolized by soybean plants, much the way atrazine is metabolized by corn plants. We also saw some issues with different PPO herbicides. Again, that goes back to those soybean varietal tolerances to those different PPOs, especially in combination with seed treatments. We also saw carryover from some herbicides like atrazine, clopyralid, and even from some products that we would not normally expect to see carryover, where that replant interval window is maybe 7 to 8 months. We should have normally been clear of that, but having a really dry fall caused those herbicides to persist a little bit in the soil. I would say probably the most important thing going on in this May timeframe, while we did get some moisture to help emergence along, we were still really dry through the latter part of May and especially into June. And that caused a lot of our pre-products and our early post products that carried residual activity to not be activated. So those products that have residual activity are ones that the pre-emergence type products control those seedlings as they're germinating and emerging. And in order for them to be taken in, they need to be kind of in that soil solution at that zone in which they're emerging through. So that takes moisture or incorporation. For most products, it's anywhere from a quarter of an inch of rain to over a half inch of rain to get those incorporated into the soil. And usually you need that within 7 to 14 days after you've sprayed. And we just didn't get that rainfall across much of the state. So this led to some weed management challenges later on, which I'll get to in the next video. But that's probably the thing that we all notice at this point in time. Fairly slow growth, uneven emergence, and dry conditions continuing to cause issues with things like herbicide application. Thanks for watching, and be sure to tune in to our next video where we'll cover what that midsummer looks like from the June through July, getting into most of the vegetative and the beginning stages of the reproductive growth in corn and soybeans. Thanks for watching. Take care.